On July 9th, 1776, New Yorkers received the news from Philadelphia. They are now citizens of a new country. The Declaration of Independence has been signed.
The Declaration of Independence obviously was a crystallizing moment. People realized that they had cut the cord and that there was no easy turning back.
If I remain loyal to England, 3,000 miles away, I become an enemy in my own land. If I follow the rest of my countrymen, I become an enemy to my mother country. How can I even start to unravel this argument when all reason has turned to killing and bloodshed?
A crowd pulls down the statue of George III, erected only 3 years earlier. The head is displayed on the end of a stake. The rest will be hauled away to be melted down into bullets.
4,000 pounds of lead to be made into musket balls. I hope that emanations from George will make a deep impression on some of his red-coated Tory subjects.
War is coming. New Yorkers watch the harbor with apprehension.
I'm sitting in the outhouse, which has a good view of the harbor. I get my discharge, and then I look out the window. Well, I can't believe my eyes. It's like a forest of pine trees are moving in out there. In 10 minutes, the whole bay is full of ships. Looks like all London has floated here.
30,000 troops, 10,000 sailors, 300 supply ships, 30 battleships with 1,200 cannon. It is the largest seaborne attack ever attempted by England until the 20th century.
A whole host of emotions must have gone through Americans, wondering, did they have the stuff to take on the largest army, the largest empire in the world? And seeing this huge force, realizing that the British were not going to let this empire go without a big fight, it must have been a terrifying and frightening moment in July of 1776.
News of the Declaration of Independence reaches Ambrose Searle, Secretary to Admiral Howe of the British Navy.
We are presently at anchor in full view of New York and the rebel headquarters under Washington. We heard that Congress has announced that the colonies are to be independent states. The madness of these deluded people.
As far as the British were concerned, there was both an emotional and a practical response to American independence. The emotional response is, how dare they? How dare they? You know, that the British had fought to clear the French out of North America, that these people were subjects of the British Crown, that this was totally unacceptable.
King George is determined to restore British sovereignty to the colonies. But he is reluctant to wage an all-out war.
War was a war against foreigners. War is real war. War is a war against national enemies. But the Americans weren't foreigners. They were Englishmen, Scotsmen. They were the king's subjects, deluded perhaps, misguided, troublesome, turbulent, inconvenient, but not foreigners, not an enemy, not people you could or should think in terms of fighting a war against.
The British forces are led by two brothers. Viscount Richard Howe heads the Navy. Sir William Howe leads the Army. They plan a demonstration of British naval power, fully confident that this will force the rebels to the bargaining table. July 12, 1776. Admiral Howe orders two of his frigates, the Phoenix and the Rose, to sail up the Hudson, guns blazing.
The roar of the cannon is so terrible that many in our army and navy have never heard anything like it before. Apparently, the rebels were frightened by the din. The whole scene is awful, grand, I might even say beautiful, except for the sad fact that people's lives are at stake, even if they are the lowest of criminals.
After this show of force, the Howes send out peace feelers to General Washington. Surely now he will be willing to negotiate. They meet at Colonel Henry Knox's headquarters on Broadway.
Under a flag of truce, General Washington met with no less than the Adjutant General of Howe's army. He informed our commander that Lord Howe had come to New York with great powers to pardon those in rebellion. General Washington told him that he had come to the wrong place. The Americans had not offended, therefore they needed no pardon. This confused the adjutant. Has Your Excellency no particular message which you would honor me to convey to Lord and General Howe? Nothing, sir, but my compliments to them both, replied Washington, upon which he bowed, and they parted on the most genteel terms imaginable.
The message is clear. The Americans will not back down. This means war. A war which will begin here in New York City.
New York was virtually indefensible for the Americans. It was an island. We didn't have a navy. The British had a navy. It was one of the most difficult locales for Washington to even conceive of defending. I think he would have preferred not to have tried, but the Continental Congress felt that some show had to be made, and he agreed.
The British must wait 2 months for all their ships and supplies to arrive. Meanwhile, they stage on Staten Island. In the sweltering New York summer, the soldiers train. Led by officers in heavy wool coats and wigs, they parade in full battle dress. They write home about the heat, the ferocious mosquitoes, and the American women.
The fair nymphs on Staten Island are fresh meat for our men. A girl cannot step into the bushes to pick a rose without risk of being ravaged. We have the most entertaining court-martials every day.
The British are joined by 8,000 German troops, known as Hessians. With a reputation for being savage fighters, these soldiers are rented from German princes for £7 a head. The British forces are among the biggest, best trained, and toughest armies in the world. They believe Washington's troops will present no serious opposition.
But a lot of the generals had been to America because they had been fighting there in the 7 Years' War, in the French and Indian War, and their opinion of colonial troops was on the whole pretty low. They didn't think much of colonial troops, and, you know, who were the senior officers of the colonial militia? Men like Major Washington, who'd surrendered the moment he'd met the French the first time. This was the kind of thing which didn't inspire confidence among experienced professional soldiers, and they tended to take the view that colonial troops were all very well as long as you kept them out of the way of the enemy.
The men who joined the American Army could not be more different from the hardened career soldiers of the British Army. The Americans come with a variety of motives. Some are patriotic. Some are just in search of adventure. A typical soldier is Joseph Plum Martin, a young farmer from Connecticut. In a diary which he will keep for the 7 years of the war, he records the day of his enlistment.
Last year when I saw my friends marching off, I went home, bit my fingernails, imagining them all telling me of their exploits, swaggering home, their hairbreadth escapes. So I took up a pen, made my mark, and joined. Now, they make you sign up for a whole year. I was just hoping to get a priming before I took on the whole coat of paint of a soldier.
The soldiers come from all over. The sovereign state of Maryland, the plantations of Virginia, and the wilderness of New Hampshire. Many young men have never been away from home. They are meeting people from other states for the first time in their lives.
You know, they put me in this regiment, half New Englanders and half Pennsylvanians. These folks as different as night and day. And myself, I'd rather be fighting with a tribe of Indians than with these Southerners. I mean, they're foreigners. Can hardly speak English. They don't like me either. And they call me that damn Yankee. That's about the nicest thing they say.
One has to remember that in 1776, Americans are not in any way one nation yet. In fact, most people would have thought of their nation, if they talked in those terms, or of their country, as Virginia or Connecticut or Massachusetts, and their loyalties were to their province, which had, each of them had its own long history. And I think that was a question that a lot of people wondered in 1776 about the term American. Just how American are they, and whether they weren't Virginians and Massachusetts and Connecticut people first.
The general has heard that jealousies have arisen among the troops from the different provinces. Name-calling, which causes irritation and can only serve to hurt the noble cause in which we are all engaged. The provinces are all united to oppose a common enemy. All distinctions must be sunk in the name American. George Washington.
Washington's goal is to forge a united and professional army. He is fiercely determined that the British see him as a general worthy of the name. In 18th century terms, that also means being a proper gentleman.
There's no character in the Revolution who is so obsessed with doing what was proper, what the best people thought was the right thing to do. One of his first books that he owned was, and that he copied out assiduously at the age of 16, were rules of etiquette from a courtesy manual. Washington is a man of intense self-will, very quick to anger, but he controlled it. Almost his whole career is an act of will. The reason he behaved the way he did, sometimes in a wooden-like fashion, was because he was trying to live up to what he saw was the ideal classical image of a hero.
Of course, a great part of the problem was that the British had not treated the American officers like gentlemen before the war, when they had been mere provincial officers. And it's often said that if only the British had made George Washington a regular colonel in the armed forces of the Crown, he wouldn't have been a revolutionary at all. Indeed, might have been fighting energetically to put the rebellion down.
One observer is Nicholas Creswell, an English traveler.
I met Washington, you know. Before the war, I visited him at Mount Vernon. He's an honest man, no vices, except, of course, ambition. He's not well educated, he doesn't speak very well, but there is something about him that makes people close to him very loyal. Look at how he's managed to hold together all those stubborn, headstrong groups he's had to work with.
August 21st. An American spy reports to Washington that Lower Long Island, what is now Brooklyn, will be the first target of the British. Washington rushes in reinforcements.
We immediately start fortifying our positions. Fear is a great inspiration for hard work. I have my gun, canteen, knapsack, and a blanket. It's my first battle. Will I be able to kill someone else?
The next morning, under cover of the formidable guns of the British Navy, 15,000 British troops land unopposed at the southern tip of Long Island. Waiting behind defensive barricades 3 miles away are the Americans. They are outnumbered 2 to 1. The British regiments, in dense formation, march up the open fields toward the heights. Their plan? To crush the rebellion in one decisive battle.
The British advance to within about 300 yards of us and begin a very heavy fire. Bullets and shells fly very fast, now and then taking off ahead.
It's very, very difficult to reconstruct these extraordinary battles of the past. But they did indeed form up in dense ranks, very carefully ordered. They did march up to within musket shot of each other with the officers in front. And they did fire at each other at very close range indeed. A man firing at another 100 yards away had almost no chance of hitting him. The ball might go anywhere. So the only way you could be certain of inflicting casualties on the enemy was to mass your men as closely as possible together. So both sides formed up into compact clumps and fired at each other, each hoping that the other would run away.
Once you would have loaded for the first volley, fired your first volley, returned your musket and reloaded, the noise was such that there was no hearing anything. You couldn't hear commands. You'd be very lucky if you could hear a drum beat, for instance, which was one of the reasons they used drums for various commands once the volleying started. But it was then fire at will, and you just kept firing until you heard either a drum beat or somebody yelling in your ear, cease fire, cease fire. There was no organization after about the third volley.
The Patriots hold the high ground. They shoot down on the advancing enemy soldiers. The British realize that they must change tactics or suffer heavy casualties.
Howe was a professional. When he came over with his troops, he immediately sent out his light dragoons to scout the territory. He also had some local Tories that were guiding him, and they found out that the passway over on the American left was virtually unguarded. The Americans, not knowing any topography, they just slipped up, and they left the Jamaica Pass unguarded.
With half their forces in the front, keeping the Americans occupied, a division of 10,000 British soldiers marches undetected through the Jamaica Pass to a position behind the American lines.
Our men stand amazingly well until 12 o'clock, when the main party of British, by a route we never dreamt of, surround us.
Suddenly they looked around, and here was Howe's army coming up behind them. Here was Howe's army coming up on the side. They had to control the line. Which way could they fire? They simply broke and they ran.
The Americans have only one escape route, through the Gowanus Marsh. The British slaughter the fleeing soldiers.
I can't describe the confusion and the horror of the scene. Artillery flying, our men running in every direction, and everywhere we turn, we meet the British or the Hessians. Men up to their knees in mud, screaming for help. Everyone else running to save their own skins.
It was a catastrophe. And partly it's American amateurism at fighting this kind of big battle. They'd never fought a battle on that scale before. They'd never had an organization that was designed to fight that kind of battle before. This is new, and they got clobbered.
The rebels have courage, but British discipline wins the day. They're raw troops, never seen action before. Their officers have no understanding of the strategies of war. The Maryland soldiers were from the best families in the province. They were heroes, cut down in the bloom of their youth. The pursuit and slaughter lasted for many hours.
At that moment, in late August of 1776, it really looks as if you're going to lose the war in the first battle, just as the British commanders had predicted you would. British planning is based on the idea of one big decisive battle, and this looks like it, the Battle of Long Island.
The Americans have retreated to Brooklyn Heights. Facing them is the British Army. At their backs is the East River. Almost the entire Continental Army is trapped. The British wait for Washington to surrender.
In the 18th century, in European warfare, it wasn't just a question of winning, but it was also a question of how you won. In a way, it was better to lose well than to win badly. That was they thought the form and ritual of warfare was very important, and wished to behave like gentlemen at all times.
According to the gentlemanly rules of warfare, Washington should concede defeat. Instead, when night falls and a thick fog blankets the East River, he orders his troops to keep all their campfires burning. Then, quietly, he begins to ferry men, horses, and cannon back to Manhattan, a few boatloads at a time. By morning, the entire American army has crossed over to New York.
And the British finally discovered that the fortifications were no longer occupied. They rushed through down to the bank just as the last boat was pulling away. And the last man in the last boat was George Washington.
The British are stunned.
Washington should be very grateful to General Howe. What a kind enemy we are. Instead of crushing the frightened, trembling enemy at once, he generously gives him time to recover from his panic and regroup. 20,000 of our best men stand on the banks of the East River, like Moses looking at the promised land, with the rebel flags waving insolently in the air. The troops and officers couldn't believe that they were just standing there, not doing anything.
The American army may have escaped capture, but the British now occupy Brooklyn Heights. Their guns are trained on New York. Washington realizes that the city cannot be held. His soldiers grab everything they can, including the city's church bells, to be melted into bullets, and begin a retreat up Manhattan Island. The British move in to occupy New York City.
You can't imagine the joy of the city's inhabitants when we march in. Pure bedlam. They carry the king's officers on their shoulders. A woman pulls down the rebels' hated flag and stamps on it with contempt and indignation.
Most New Yorkers are fervently loyal to England, not to the Revolution. Indeed, about 1/5 of the entire American population will remain loyalists throughout the war. They must keep their political views to themselves in areas where patriots are in control. But here in New York, it is the supporters of the Revolution who must keep quiet or leave.
We have fled. It was raining and thundering so hard we had to stop by the side of the road all night. When we did find a place to stay, all we got was a dirty bed on the floor. It's very hard for us that are used to living comfortable.
Travelers will carry the accounts of the disaster in New York along the dirt roads and rivers of 18th century America. It will take over a month for the news to spread to all 13 states. Near Boston, an anxious Abigail Adams writes to her husband John in Congress in Philadelphia.
My dearest friend, there are so many rumors flying around that it is impossible to know what to believe. Did you think that we would be able to hold on to Long Island? If we could not hold Long Island, are they going to take New York City? And if they hold New York, will they be able to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies?
My best friend, I assure you that we in Congress are as much at a loss to understand what happened in New York as you are. In general, our generals were out-generaled on Long Island. Every time our militia see the British, they very courageously panic, turn their backs, and run away. Our Massachusetts men behave just as badly as everyone else.
As the British move in to occupy New York City, the Continental Army continues its retreat up through the countryside of Manhattan Island. It is not an orderly withdrawal. Troops that Washington has positioned to protect the rear of his fleeing army are themselves running at the first sight of British guns. Washington explodes into a rage.
And it's one of the few times he really lost his temper. He threw his hat on the ground, he was on horseback. He yelled at them, screamed at them. He had his horse whip, and he was actually whipping some of the officers as well as the men. And finally, he just gave up. All of this terrible pressure and disgust on him, he just sat there limply with Hessians coming at him just 80 yards away. And at that point, one of his aides-de-camp grabbed his horse and led him away.
Washington is forced to accept the fact that he will not be able to conduct a proper European-style war because he does not have a European-style army. He is beginning to realize that he can't expect volunteer soldiers fighting for liberty to blindly follow orders. He will have to persuade them.
Well, this means that you have a different kind of an army, a more democratical army maybe, a more equalitarian army maybe. And in some ways, it was a style of leadership that was going to be much more important for a Republican government later on. It was a very different kind of a relationship than you would get, for example, in the British Army, where there was no explaining, there were orders, and for those that didn't respond, there were punishments.
In the British Army, they were flogging soldiers and sailors with the greatest cheerfulness. That's what you did to a soldier if he misbehaved. You flogged him. In the Continental Army, Washington is always going around trying to persuade people. And of course, criminals in the army would be hanged or shot, but the armies run on completely different principles. So you had an army in which discipline was maintained by flogging against an army in which discipline was really ultimately maintained by exhortation.
Remember, soldiers, you are free men, fighting for the blessings of liberty. Remember that you and your descendants will become slaves if you do not acquit yourselves like men. Remember Boston and Charlestown. The enemy discovered at great cost what a few brave men, fighting for their own land, for the best of causes, could do against soldiers for hire.
The notion of having a population that is personally engaged in war is really new. The great European powers in the 18th century built their power not on a bunch of enthusiastic soldiers, but rather on professional, rather mercenary forces that they'd recruited and paid to actually harness popular enthusiasm and to make it militarily effective. That is new.
Washington and his army have retreated to Harlem Heights, 7 miles north of the city. He realizes that he must completely change tactics. Until he has more experienced soldiers, he will engage the enemy only in small skirmishes and quick retreats.
As we go forward, the rebels fly before us. It's impossible to catch them. They'll neither fight nor totally run away. They seem to be playing hide and seek with us, always hovering a day's march away.
Washington hates following a strategy of retreat. But he knows that the Continental Army must be preserved at all costs. Along with Congress, the Army is America's only national institution, the glue that holds the country together.
With the fate of America at stake, I see our job as prolonging this war as much as possible. So unless we are absolutely forced into it, our tactics are to avoid a large battle. In fact, to avoid any risks at all.
This constant retreating is hard on Washington and the soldiers. They are exhausted and frustrated. 1/5 of the army has dysentery.
The whole time is spent in marches, especially night marches. The watching, starving, freezing, and sickness. If we get any chance to rest, it'll be in the woods. Any place but someplace comfortable, lying on the wet ground. And if you close your eyes in a moment's sleep, an alarm. You stand guard for an hour or two, or you're under attack from the enemy and you have to march another 5 miles.
Joseph Plum Martin cannot wait to go home. His enlistment will be up in 2 months, along with all the rest of the army. Recruiting posters go up everywhere.
To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men, take notice. Those who may favor this recruiting party with their attendance will have the opportunity of spending a few happy years in viewing the different parts of this beautiful continent in the honorable and truly respectable character of a soldier, after which he may return home to his friends with his pockets full of money and his head covered with laurels. God save the United States.
But a losing general will attract few new enlistments. And Washington has already lost Long Island, New York City, and much of Westchester. Washington proposes something new, offering money and land to recruit soldiers for long-term enlistments. John Hancock replies to Washington.
Sir, Congress is resolved to help you in the present critical state of our affairs. In order to give you all possible assistance in keeping the army together, Congress has appointed a committee. With every sentiment of esteem and respect, your very humble servant, John Hancock.
Congress can do very little beyond forming committees. All political power remains with the individual states. Congress has no authority to tax, no way of raising money to supply or pay the army.
Washington spent a very frustrating war, there's no doubt about it, in many ways. And among the greatest of his frustrations was dealing with Congress, a Congress that could not meet his basic needs, that could not even guarantee him an army that would be there a year from now, a Congress that periodically dissolved. And yet, Washington was so committed to the rule of civilian authority over the military that he was willing to absorb those blows, to deal with those frustrations. It is a measure of Washington's character, political skill, and I would say idealism, that he could put up with this Congress and never lose sight of the larger objective.
The Americans have one stronghold left on the whole of Manhattan, Fort Washington. The fort holds most of the heavy artillery of the Continental Army. The Americans are convinced that the fort is impregnable. But the British smash its defenses in one brilliantly coordinated attack. The capture of the precious stores in Fort Washington is a disaster for the Americans. Over 100 cannon, thousands of muskets, and 400,000 cartridges. These are all manufactured in England, and the Americans have no hope of replacing them. The British follow up with an attack on Fort Lee on the other side of the Hudson River. Washington watches the fall of the two forts. 3,000 American soldiers are dead or captured. It is the tragic finale to a 3-month string of catastrophes.
To John Augustine Washington, if I were to put a curse on my worst enemy, it would be to wish him in my position now. I just do not know what to do. It seems impossible to continue my command in this situation. But if I withdraw, all will be lost.
The front has moved to New Jersey. General Howe now gives the Americans another chance to surrender with honor. He offers New Jersey citizens a royal pardon if they will renounce the rebel cause. In just 2 weeks, 3,000 Americans accept the offer, including a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
There are a lot of Americans who think it is time to give up in late 1776, that they've made the best effort they could, but that the British Army, with the British Navy behind it and the British economy behind that, are just simply too strong.
December 1776. All of New Jersey is now in the hands of the British, who are garrisoned along the northern bank of the Delaware River, 30 miles from Philadelphia. Congress has fled to Baltimore. General Howe declares the war over for the winter. It is common in the 18th century to avoid fighting in winter. Armies face impassable roads, perilous half-frozen rivers, disease and starvation. Animals are a particular problem.
A human being is tougher, much tougher, than a horse or even an ox. A human being can go longer without food as long as he has water than an animal can. An 18th century army finds it very difficult to do anything in those months when there's no grass in the fields, no fodder for the horses. You can't feed the animals.
General Howe, comfortably settled in New York City, has begun the elegant winter season of balls and banquets. The talk of the town is about an affair he is having with a certain Mrs. Loring, the wife of one of his officers. Washington has retreated from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. It has turned bitterly cold. His soldiers have no tents and little winter clothing.
No food for 2 days. Pinched with hunger. I come across an oxtail that somehow escaped the dogs. I steer off to my tent with this prize, where I throw it on the fire and broil it. It's not long in my stomach before it starts to show a great inclination to be set at liberty again. I become more and more willing to listen to its requests. And with tears at parting with what I thought was my friend, I give it a discharge. It's a while before I'll eat oxtail again.
Washington himself is now engaged in a personal battle for survival. Among the Army's top generals, there is open talk of replacing him.
Washington's attitude in late 1776 is one more of desperation than anything else. He's thinking that probably he'd be better send instructions back to his own estate and make provisions for the British winning the war. So there's not much on his mind except survival well into the month of December in 1776. Things look really bad, very bad indeed.
To John Augustine Washington, I have begged Congress again and again to send me soldiers with long-term enlistments. All I get back is delays and quarrels. Then the state send me officers who aren't fit to polish boots. John, I'm sick to death of what is going on. Every day things get worse. Congress botches things up, and I get blamed.
We have a report from an informant close to Washington's family. The general looks extremely dejected. He spends much of his time alone. People who have walked in on him found him in tears. His army has no blankets, none of the necessities of life. They're even out of salt. I have corroborated these facts with other informants.
Christmas is approaching. John Hancock sends Washington a gift, a barrel of his wife's salted fish.
To John Hancock, my grateful thanks for the salted fish. I'm very fond of salted fish, but never think of it until it is placed before me. I hope you have not gone to too much trouble sending it to camp on my account. My compliments to Mrs. Hancock. George Washington.
The fate of the United States now rests on Washington and 6,000 men. The first army in modern history to be fighting for a political ideal is facing its darkest moment. Traveling with the weary, exhausted soldiers is Tom Paine, the brilliant British writer whose pamphlet Common Sense had convinced many Americans to embrace independence. On a drumhead, he writes one of the most quoted essays in the English language. It is called The American Crisis. Washington immediately orders all of his officers to read it to their troops. He hopes its words will inspire them to hold on for just a little longer.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country.
But they that stand it now deserve the love and thanks of men and women.
Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. But the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
Heaven knows how to put a proper price on its goods. It would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
I fear not. I see no cause of fear. In the end, we will be the victors. For though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the ember will never expire.
It is just before Christmas. The soldiers' terms of enlistment will be up on December 31st. In 1 week, Washington will be a general without an army. Across the Delaware River from the Americans, in the small town of Trenton, New Jersey, the Hessian colonel Johann Rall and his brigade prepare to celebrate the holidays. Rall is in high spirits. He gives little thought to the American forces camped just across the river.
We don't need trenches or fortifications. The rebel soldiers, those country clowns, they're almost naked, dying of cold, have no provisions, no blankets. Let them come. We shall welcome them with our bayonets.
Washington decides to risk all his troops in a surprise offensive. Horses and cannon and the remains of his army will cross the half-frozen Delaware River in the middle of the night and launch an attack on the Hessian camp at Trenton. It's his last roll of the dice. All or nothing.
The key is absolute secrecy. We do not really have enough men for the task, but we have no choice. Coordinate with Griffin and attack on as many of their posts as possible. The more confusion we can spread, the better.
December the 23rd, new orders. We are moving out with 3 days' rations. General Washington has just given the password for this operation. Victory
or death. The plan is to move 2,500 men and 18 field guns across the river. Seems impossible. It's cold and stormy. Ice is floating in the river. The troops march to the boats in the most profound silence.
Christmas, 3 a.m. All the troops have crossed the river and the boats have gone back for the artillery. I've never seen Washington so determined. He stands on the bank of the river, wrapped in his cloak, overseeing the landing of his troops, calm and collected.
We begin our march to Trenton. The horses pulling the cannon slip and slide. They're without shoes. So are the soldiers. The road to Trenton is literally marked with the blood of the soldiers' feet.
A great commotion near the meeting house. A Hessian running out from the house, yelling in German. 3 or 4 others come out with their guns. Bullets whistle over our heads.
The surprise is complete. Rahl and his regiment are drunk and asleep. By the time they realize what is happening, the trap has sprung.
The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy is a scene out of the final judgment. They try to form lines in the streets, but our howitzers are already in place. They run behind the houses to hide, but we go after them with muskets.
Commander Rahl tumbles from his horse. His soldiers throw down their guns. We take 1,200 prisoners.
Colonel Rahl, who was, he was a great fighter, but he was also a great drinker and a great braggart. It's interesting that Christmas night, he was at a party, and a man came to the door to see him. He said, "It's very urgent, I've got to see him, let him know." And Rahl wouldn't bother seeing him, so finally the man wrote a note, and they gave it to Rahl, and they found it in his pocket after he died 2 days later. And it said, "The Americans are coming to attack you tomorrow morning." He never bothered to read it.
The victory at Trenton is a startling reversal of fortune. Washington follows up with the defeat of a British brigade in the town of Princeton, 10 miles away. Suddenly, the whole psychological picture of the war has changed.
Actually, Trenton is a small skirmish. The British generals, who read their comment at the time, they're saying, how tiresome. But they don't regard it as being that serious in itself. You know, these things happen in war.
Well, in military terms, it isn't a big deal. You lost 1,000 Germans, but you can always go hire another 1,000 Germans. But it's extremely important on the American side. As the news spreads to all the colonies, there is a feeling that it may indeed be possible to reverse the course of this war.
New Jersey civilians who had signed a loyalty oath to the king come back to supporting the revolution. Volunteers from all 13 states are rushing to fill the ranks of the dwindling army. And Washington, whose very command had been in doubt only a few days before, now becomes a national hero.
This Washington is certainly a most surprising man, a natural-born general. The fact that this Negro-driving plantation owner can muster together some ragged beggars, the refuse of other nations, and keep England's most experienced soldiers at bay is, well, astonishing. Our country's finest chased by a tobacco planter. Poor old England, how thy laurels have tarnished.
From that point, he seems to be able to do no wrong. Washington, after these 2 little military victories, seems to exemplify the revolution. He is the revolution.